It was a cold, foggy evening in the small town of Willowbrook. The streets were quiet, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Detective James Carter sat in his dimly lit office, sipping on a cup of coffee. He was a tall man with sharp features and a keen eye for detail. His reputation as the best detective in town was well earned, and he had solved many mysteries that had left others baffled. Just as he was about to call it a night, there was a knock on the door. It was Mrs. Eleanor Whitaker, a wealthy widow known for her vast collection of antiques. She looked distressed, her hands trembling as she clutched her handbag. "Detective Carter, I need your help," she said, her voice shaking. "Something terrible has happened." "Please, sit down, Mrs. Whitaker," Detective Carter said, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. "Tell me what's wrong." Mrs. Whitaker took a deep breath and began her story. "Last night, someone broke into my house and stole a priceless heirloom, a diamond necklace that has been in my family for generations. It's not just the monetary value, Detective. The necklace holds great sentimental value to me. I need your help to find it." Detective Carter listened carefully, taking notes as she spoke. "Do you have any idea who might have taken it?" he asked. Mrs. Whitaker hesitated for a moment before answering. "There is one person I suspect: my nephew, Charles. He has always been envious of the necklace and has been in financial trouble lately. But I have no proof, and I don't want to accuse him without evidence." Detective Carter nodded. "I understand. I'll start investigating right away. Can you give me a list of people who were in your house recently?" Mrs. Whitaker provided the list, and Detective Carter began his investigation the next morning. His first stop was the Whitaker Mansion, a grand old house with high ceilings and ornate furniture. He examined the scene of the crime, looking for any clues that might lead him to the thief. The window in the study had been forced open, and there were muddy footprints on the carpet. Detective Carter took samples of the mud and dusted the window for fingerprints. He also noticed a small piece of fabric caught on the window frame, which he carefully collected. Next, he interviewed the household staff. The butler, Mr. Thompson, had been with the family for over 20 years and was deeply loyal to Mrs. Whitaker. He claimed to have heard nothing unusual that night. The maid, Sarah, had been off duty and was visiting her family in the next town. Detective Carter then turned his attention to Charles Whitaker, Mrs. Whitaker's nephew. Charles was a young man in his late 20s, with a reputation for being reckless and irresponsible. When Detective Carter visited him at his apartment, Charles seemed nervous and defensive. "I had nothing to do with the theft," Charles insisted. "Yes, I've had some financial problems, but I would never steal from my own family." Detective Carter studied Charles carefully. "Where were you last night?" he asked. "I was at a friend's house, playing cards," Charles replied. "You can ask him if you don't believe me." Detective Carter took down the friend's contact information and left. He then visited the local pawn shops to see if anyone had tried to sell a diamond necklace recently. At the third shop, he struck gold. The shopkeeper remembered a man matching Charles's description, trying to sell a necklace just that morning. Armed with this information, Detective Carter returned to Charles's apartment. This time, he brought a search warrant. As he searched the apartment, he found the missing necklace hidden in a drawer, along with the muddy shoes that matched the footprints at the crime scene. Charles was arrested and charged with the theft. Mrs. Whitaker was relieved to have her heirloom back, though she was saddened by her nephew's betrayal. As Detective Carter returned to his office, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Another mystery solved, thanks to his keen observation and relentless pursuit of the truth. He poured himself another cup of coffee and leaned back in his chair, ready for the next case that would come his way. And so, the legend of Detective James Carter continued to grow, one mystery at a time. The Vicar's Watch. Title: The Vicar's Watch. It was a quiet Sunday morning in the peaceful village of Ashwood. The church bells rang out, calling the villagers to the morning service. Among the attendees was Detective Henry Blackwood, who had come to the village for a short holiday. He sat in the back pew, observing the congregation with his usual sharp eye. The service was led by the village vicar, Reverend Samuel Whitcomb, a kind and gentle man loved by all. As the service concluded, Reverend Whitcomb approached Detective Blackwood with a troubled expression. "Detective Blackwood, I wonder if I might have a word with you," the vicar said, his voice low. "Oaf, Reverend," Blackwood replied, following him to the vestry. Once inside, Reverend Whitcomb closed the door and sighed deeply. "I'm afraid something rather distressing has happened. My pocket watch, a family heirloom passed down through generations, has gone missing. It was last seen on my desk in the vestry yesterday evening." Detective Blackwood nodded, his interest piqued. "Do you have any idea who might have taken it?" The vicar hesitated. "I hate to think ill of anyone, but there is one person who has been acting rather strangely lately, Mr. Harold Grimes, the church caretaker. He has been in financial difficulties, and I've noticed him lingering around the vestry more than usual." Blackwood considered this. "I'll look into it, Reverend. In the meantime, try not to worry. We'll get to the bottom of this." Detective Blackwood began his investigation by examining the vestry. The room was small and orderly, with a desk, a few chairs, and shelves filled with books and religious items. He noticed that the window was slightly ajar, and there were faint scuff marks on the windowsill. Next, he spoke to Mr. Harold Grimes. The caretaker was a middle-aged man with a weathered face and a nervous demeanor. When questioned, Grimes denied any involvement in the theft. "I would never steal from the vicar," Grimes insisted. "He's been nothing but good to me. I was at home all evening, alone." Blackwood noted the man's unease, but decided to gather more evidence before drawing any conclusions. He then visited the local pawn shop, where he inquired about any recent attempts to sell a pocket watch. The shopkeeper recalled a man matching Grimes's description, trying to pawn a watch just that morning. Armed with this information, Blackwood returned to the church. He found Grimes in the garden, tending to the flowers. "Mr. Grimes," Blackwood said, "I have reason to believe you were involved in the theft of Reverend Whitcomb's pocket watch. Would you care to explain?" Grimes's face turned pale. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. Blackwood produced the pawnshop receipt from his pocket. "This says otherwise. Care to tell me why you tried to sell the vicar's watch?" Grimes looked down, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I was desperate," he admitted. "I needed money to pay off some debts. I thought no one would miss the watch for a while, and I could return it once I had the funds. I never meant to cause any harm." Detective Blackwood escorted Grimes back to the vicarage, where Reverend Whitcomb was waiting. Upon hearing the caretaker's confession, the vicar's face softened with compassion. "Harold, I'm disappointed, but I understand your desperation," Reverend Whitcomb said. "We all face trials in life. Let us find a way to help you through this without resorting to theft." Grimes nodded, tears in his eyes. "I'm truly sorry, Reverend. I don't know what came over me." Detective Blackwood arranged for the watch to be retrieved from the pawn shop and returned to the vicar. Grimes, though remorseful, faced the consequences of his actions, but with the vicar's support, he was given a chance to make amends. As Detective Blackwood prepared to leave Ashwood, Reverend Whitcomb thanked him for his help. You've not only recovered my watch, but also helped a troubled soul find his way back. I am deeply grateful. Blackwood tipped his hat. It's all in a day's work, Reverend. Take care of yourself and of Harold. With that, Detective Henry Blackwood left the village, another mystery solved, and a reminder that even in the quietest places, secrets and struggles could be found.